Hello and welcome to the Grim Tutors, your one-stop shop for all things Magic the Gathering. I'm Colton, also known as Pez.
And I'm Oblivion. So, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about how to take a turn in Magic the Gathering.
How do you take a turn in Magic the Gathering?
Well, first off, you have to decide who's going first.
So we should talk about how we start the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, how do we start the game?
Usually, starting the game of Magic the Gathering is decided by rolling 2d6s and see who gets the highest roll.
But it can be determined in other ways, too.
It can. You could do really anything. You flip a coin, play rock, paper, scissors, roll a d20, roll a d100.
You and your opponents will mutually agree on a way to decide who goes first. So we've decided who's going first. Now what happens?
Now you will draw your 7 cards.
Usually while you're figuring out who goes first, that's when you're like shuffling your library and stuff. While you're shuffling and figuring out who goes first, after you've shuffled your library to your likeness, the unwritten rule of Miss Manners Magic the Gathering is that you present your deck to an opponent and offer for them to either cut your deck or tap it. So what does that mean?
They can also shuffle it.
Oh, I've never had that happen.
Yeah, your opponent is allowed to pick up your deck and shuffle it themselves.
So if I offer my deck to you and you cut it, what does that mean?
It means that I take your deck and split it into a few little piles and rearrange it to basically, like, say that you're not cheating, right? It's a way to, if your opponent stacked their deck kind of thing, then you just unstacked their deck. And you're playing fair Magic.
And some people don't like to mess with other people's libraries, so if you give them the option, they might say tap, or you're good, or pat the top of your library, which means they don't want to cut it.
They trust that you're not cheating.
It's a good thing to talk about because the first time I went to go play Magic the Gathering and I had someone shoving their cards to me and saying cut or tap, I didn't know what the fuck I was supposed to do with that.
You're supposed to pull out the scissors and cut them in half.
And tap it gently on the top with a hammer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once you have presented your library and received it back from your opponent, now it's time to get your starting hand.
You draw those 7 cards, look at them, determine if you want to keep them or not. If you do, then that's fine and dandy. If you don't, you do a mulligan, which is you put your 7 cards back into your library, you draw a new 7, and then if you decide that that is good, you have to put 1 card from your hand onto the bottom of your library. And so on and so forth for how many times you mulligan down is how many cards you have to get rid of. So say I mulliganed 3 times, now I have to get rid of 3 cards from my hand.
But you get to draw 7 every time and look at the whole 7 and make your determinations from there.
Right.
It's a good thing that we're going to have another friend join us to tell us about mulligans, right?
Yeah, we're going to have a whole video dedicated to that.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of strategy behind it. I didn't really realize when I started playing.
Yeah, lots of deep thinking.
Then, once everyone has their hands, usually a player will ask if there are any pre-game actions.
Pre-game actions usually come from cards like Ley Lines or Gemstone Cavern sort of things where you have something to do before the game technically starts.
Yeah, there are some cards that say if this card's in your opening hand, you can put it on the battlefield. Or if this card's in your opening hand and you're not going first, you can do some other things and put it on the battlefield. So it's kind of like you get to play a card before the game even starts.
So after pre-game actions are determined, you now start your first turn. So let's say that you're going first in a 2-player game. You do not get to draw a card off of the top of your library. But if you're going second in a 2-player game, you do get to draw a card off of the top of your library.
Which is something that makes Commander a little funky, is that in this 4-player game, you can draw a card if you are going first.
In a Commander game, everyone gets to draw a card their first turn.
We have drawn or not drawn our card. And that's where the steps, the phases come into play.
Technically, the first phase that you have is untap and then upkeep, then draw your cards. So if you're just starting out the game, technically, if you have no pre-game actions, the first thing you're going to do, if you're not going first in a 2-player game, is drawing your card. But if you're going first, you would not draw your card. So in technicalities, you would skip forward to your main phase 1.
Those, on your first turn, the untap and upkeep steps still technically happen, but just no actions are taken.
Right, because there's nothing on the battlefield yet.
Yeah. You still technically move through those phases, but you're not doing anything. So we're playing a 2-player game of Magic, and I'm going first. I have moved through my Untap and my Upkeep steps, and I don't get to draw a card because we're playing a 2-player game, and I'm going first. So now, what do I do?
Now you go to your main phase 1. Your main phase 1 is where you can play your lands and cast your spells. Fun note is that you can only play 1 land per turn in a game of Magic the Gathering unless you have cards that state otherwise.
Then, after you have played your land and cast any spells that you wish during this main phase of your turn, then you get to go to punchies.
After your main phase 1, you move to combat.
Combat has its own set of steps. Has like mini phases. The first phase is moving to combat. So you are declaring that you are ending your main phase and moving to combat. Why is this so important?
It is important because your opponent could have things to cast before you go to combat. They could have instants that they would like to cast before you move phases.
It's also important for you as the player taking your turn, because once you've moved to combat, you can't play sorceries anymore or any other permanents. Going into combat and through the duration of the whole combat chunk of your turn, you and your opponents can only cast instants unless a card states otherwise. But we know how that goes, right? So we have declared that we are going from main phase to combat. Then what do we do?
Then we declare our attackers.
So declaring your attackers is declaring that you are going to attack with X creature to X opponent. It's really easy when you're only playing a 2-player game because there's only one person to attack.
After you have declared an attackers, your opponent declares a blocker if they have one. So you declare your attacker, your opponent declares a block.
The next chunk of combat is the damage is dealt.
Which means that the creatures that you attacked with will deal their damage. If they're blocked, you and your opponent's creatures will hit each other, kind of thing. That's kind of the nice little quick easy combat there.
Combat has so many important rules and steps and things to think about. So we've decided that we're going to add an episode in our How to Play series to tell you all about the ins and outs of combat, because there are some things that are like specific nuances, including your creatures don't tap when they block, which is the thing I didn't know.
Then after you move to damage in combat, you move to cleanup. So if there's any creatures that died, you will then take those creatures and put them into your graveyard, or your opponent will put their creature into their graveyard.
And then we get to go on to main phase 2, Electric Boogaloo.
Your main phase 2 is the exact same thing as your main phase 1, but still the stipulation of you can only play 1 land per turn. If you can, in this main phase 2, if you haven't played your land yet, you can then play your land, and you can cast sorceries, creatures, whatever you want in your main phase 2.
It's also helpful to note that on a lot of cards, they might talk about like pre-combat main phase. That's when they're talking about main phase 1, or the first time you're in main phase. You can play a land and cast things before you go to combat and after.
After main phase 2, you have your end step. End step is where your creatures will heal the damage that is on them, and you will pass the turn to your opponent. If you have more than 7 cards in your hand, you will discard down to 7 cards, stuff like that.
And of course, like with anything in Magic, there are some cards that tell you on your end step something happens. So it's just important to know that there are game actions that can occur as you are essentially passing the turn to your opponent.
Your opponent also, when you're moving through all of these phases, gets a chance to respond to whatever you're doing, which is something to also take note of.
Even if you're not doing anything, just moving from phase to phase is an opportunity for them to commit some sort of heinous atrocity against you.
Absolutely.
It's also important to note that your end step is still your turn. So if there is some sort of rule in play that stipulates how many things can happen per turn, like a deafening silence perhaps,
A rule of law.
if an opponent were to cast an instant on your end step, it would not affect their turn if they were next in turn order, because technically it happened on your turn.
Say they cast a lightning bolt in your combat step, and then they tried to cast another lightning bolt on your end step. They cannot do that because your deafening silence and or rule of law effect says that they can only play one spell a turn.
We have mentioned before when we talked about different kinds of cards way back in the day, like a month ago. We talked about instants and we talked about sorceries. And it's just important to remember that you and your opponents can cast instants at any time, but sorceries can only be cast on your turn during your main phases, unless, of course, you have a card that says otherwise. So if you wanted to, you could cast an instant on your upkeep. These are all just very small nuanced things that you can think about.
Pick up and learn when you play the game more. You'll learn when's the best time to cast your instants and your sorceries and play your creatures and all that kind of stuff. It is something that I had a really hard time with when I first started playing the game. Was I would always cast my instants or do anything that I was doing in my main phase 1. So I was just showing all of my stuff to my opponent during my first main phase. You should really spread it out kind of thing, or you should really save your instants for your opponent's turns, because that's when they're the best, because you're playing it on their turn and not your turn.
There are some things that are best to do at certain times. Like if you need that land to cast something, play it on main phase 1. That makes total sense. But as you grow in your Magic the Gathering journey, you'll come to realize that sometimes showing how much land you have, showing how many cards you have in your hand, are opportunities for your opponent to gain information, because there are some real smart cookies out there that just, they look at what you have on the battlefield and they look at how many cards in your hand and they can guess what you might have, or at least have some really good ideas about it. So those are just, strategies down the line to think about. It's not anything to pressure yourself with. The number one thing about Magic the Gathering is that it's fun.
Yeah, just have a good time. Make Magic the Gathering what you want it to be.
We've walked through how we start the game, and we've walked through how you go about the game and how you take your turns. So when is this fucking game over?
A game of Magic the Gathering ends when your life total is empty, or you have received 10 or more poison counters, or you have no cards in your library, and you go to draw a card from an empty library.
You also at any time can enact the rule
104.3a, I believe.
That sounds right. At any time, you may concede a game of Magic the Gathering. So it's over when you lose all your life, you have 10 or more poison counters, or your library is empty and you go to draw a card. Now, of course, because it's Magic the Gathering and it's built to confuse and mystify even the smartest person around, there are things that can prevent that. Things that say you can't win the game and
your opponents can't lose the game.
Or I guess it's you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. Nothing happens to you if you draw a card from an empty library.
There are cards that just say you win the game.
There are cards that say you don't lose the game if your life total is 0 or less.
There's lots of funky things out there. There's cards like Laboratory Maniac, which when you attempt to draw from an empty library, you instead win the game. In games of Commander, if someone were to receive 21 damage from a single commander, they would lose the game.
And it's not 21 commander damage. It's you and 3 of your friends, and Jill hit me for 7, and Bob hit me for 7, and Derek hit me for 7. It's 21 from one single guy.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to check us out on social media, it's at Grim Tutors MTG.
If you'd like to support us on Patreon to help us continue to create this awesome content, you can find us at patreon.com/thegrimtutors. We're so excited to be seeing the finish line of teaching you how to play the game so we can start teaching you how to play the game.
Absolutely. We'll start releasing gameplay videos very soon. Thanks for watching.
We'll see you next time.
Toodaloo.
Bye. And I think we're going to start with Standard.
Yay.
You don't sound excited.
I love Standard.
Well, you might, because by the time we do it...
Throne will be out. Standard will be different.
You mean Wilds?
Yeah, Wilds of Eldraine. Oh, I will call it Throne of Eldraine forever.
Probably.
We just went back to it. Feels like I was just there, and then we're already back. Even though us being there was at the end of like 2019 or something like that, I'm pretty sure.
Even people that you do know that might have different...
We're doing business over here.
I see that.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support us, check us out on social medias at the Grim Tutors MTG.
That hit me in the foot.
That hit her in the foot.
That was so sensual.